The ballroom of Hartwell House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, each flame caught and multiplied in the crystal drops of the chandeliers. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, hot house roses, and the faint, metallic whisper of anticipation that clung to the silk and velvet of the ton. Lady Alara Vance felt the weight of 100 curious stares upon her shoulders. She stood near the French windows, her hand resting lightly on her aunt's arm, a figure of quiet poise in a gown of deep sapphire silk that made her skin seem to glow like alabaster. She was not the wealthiest heiress present, nor the most boldly beautiful. Yet there was something in the directness of her gray eyes, in the calm set of her mouth, that spoke of a spirit not easily broken. Across the crowded room, he stood in conversation with two gentlemen. Alexander Ashworth, the Duke of Moreland. They called him the Cold Duke. It was a title earned not through cruelty, but through an impenetrable reserve. His dark hair was brushed back from a forehead that spoke of intellect and command. His eyes, the color of winter seas, held a guardedness that had repelled the most determined of matchmaking mammas. His shoulders seemed to carry the weight of his ancient lineage with an unapproachable grace. He was a man carved from duty and shadow, and every young woman in the room had, at some point, dreamed of thawing him. But for 2 years, Alara had been permitted a closeness to him that others were not. Theirs was a quiet alliance of the mind. She had conversed with him about land management, about the poetry of Blake, about the burdens of legacy. She had seen, she believed, the man behind the icy facade. He had looked at her with something other than dismissal. He had listened. And in those moments, a fragile, desperate hope had taken root in her heart. Tonight she had resolved to test that hope. The Dowager Marchioness of Rothwell, a viper in silk, had spent the better part of the season whispering that Alara was nothing but a fortune hunter, a country mouse reaching for a coronet. The whispers had not reached the Duke's ears, she was sure of it. He would not believe them. He knew her. As the musicians began a waltz, she saw her opportunity. She stepped away from her aunt, moving through the throng with a steady heart. She would ask him to dance. It was a bold act, a public declaration of her regard. Her gloved fingers tightened around her fan. She approached him as his companions bowed and moved away. He turned, and for a fleeting moment, something softened in his expression. It gave her courage. "Your Grace," she said, her voice low but steady. "Lady Alara," he returned, his own voice a smooth, deep current. The heat of the room seemed to intensify. She felt the expectant gazes of the ton like pins upon her skin. "I had hoped," she began, a faint blush rising to her cheeks, "that you might honor me with the next dance." The request hung in the air between them. For a heartbeat his gaze remained on her, searching. Then his eyes slid past her, scanning the room, coldly calculating. A chill settled over his features, a return of that formidable, icy mask. He had heard the whispers, she realized with a sickening lurch, and he had believed them. He drew himself up to his full, imposing height. His jaw tightened. In that moment he became not Alexander, the man she had glimpsed, but the Duke of Moreland, the very incarnation of aristocratic pride. He spoke, and his voice was not raised, but it carried with the chilling clarity of a bell tolling in winter. It cut through the buzz of conversation, silencing all those nearby. "I am selective about the company I keep," he said, his gaze fixed on her with an expression of detached disdain. "And I do not dance with those who seek to use my name as a stepping stone to social advancement." The words were a physical blow, a public flaying. The blood drained from Alara's face. Her heart, which had beat with such hope moments before, now seemed to shatter into 1,000 pieces within her chest. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. She could feel their eyes on her, some shocked, some sorrowful, but many more gleaming with cruel satisfaction. The silence that followed was absolute, a vast, echoing void of humiliation. She could not move. She could not speak. The sapphire of her gown seemed to mock her, its brilliance now a beacon for her shame. She had offered him her heart, and he had crushed it beneath his polished heel for the entertainment of the ton. For a long, agonizing moment she simply stood there, the center of a maelstrom of scandal. Then, with a strength she did not know she possessed, she inclined her head. Her movement was graceful, a final act of dignity in the face of utter ruin. "Of course, Your Grace," she whispered, her voice so faint only he could hear. "How foolish of me to have forgotten my place." She turned, her back straight, her head held high, and walked from the ballroom. She felt the heat of his gaze on her back, but she did not look round. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her tears. But as she passed through the grand doors and into the cool, shadowed hallway, the first tear slipped down her cheek, hot and bitter against her skin. She had been a fool, and her entire world had just been reduced to ashes by the man she loved. The letter arrived 3 days later, carried by a grim-faced servant in the Moreland livery. It lay on the silver salver in the drawing-room of her family's London townhouse, a simple rectangle of thick, cream-colored paper that seemed to radiate a chilling authority. Ilara's hands trembled as she broke the wax seal, the ducal crest pressing into her palm like a brand. It was not an apology. It was a formal, coldly worded missive. The Duke of Moreland, it stated, would be departing for his primary seat, Wyvern Hall, within the week. He felt it necessary to clarify that any prior association between them was to be considered at an end. He wished her well, but he could not, in good conscience, encourage any further discourse. It was a dismissal of the most brutal, final kind. But the true horror was in the postscript. The Dowager Marchioness of Rothwell was to be a guest at Wyvern Hall for the autumn shooting season. Her daughter, the Lady Honoria, had long been considered a suitable match for the Duke. He intended to formally announce their engagement upon his return to London. The final sentence read, "Your continued discretion in this matter is both expected and appreciated." Ilara felt the world tilt around her. Discretion. He had destroyed her reputation in a single cruel moment, and now he demanded her silence. He had chosen the daughter of the very woman who had poisoned his mind against her. The viper had won. The pain that had begun as a sharp, stabbing wound now settled into a deep, relentless ache. It was not just the loss of his love, but the loss of her own good name. The laughter of the Tun still echoed in her ears. Her aunt, a woman of fierce loyalty and sharp intellect, read the letter with lips drawn into a thin, angry line. "This is not the action of a gentleman," she declared, her voice shaking with fury. "This is a calculated, despicable campaign. We must fight back. We must tell your side of the story." But Ilara knew the truth of their world. The word of a duke, however cruel, would always outweigh the word of a woman of lesser title. To fight would be to invite further ridicule. Her only path was to retreat. They closed up the townhouse. They refused all invitations. The whispers, she knew, would continue, but at least she would not have to hear them. Her own private despair was a far greater prison. She spent her days in the small, walled garden at the back of the house, tending to the late-blooming roses. The simple, physical act of pruning, of coaxing life from the damp earth, was the only thing that brought her any sense of peace. She would not cry. She had shed all her tears that first night, alone in her room, the echoes of the Duke's cold words playing over and over in her mind. Weeks turned into a month. The London season drew to a close, and the grand families retreated to their country estates. The scandal, she hoped, would fade with the summer, but the memory of his face, that look of detached disgust, haunted her. Then came the second letter. This one was not from the Duke. It was from his grandmother, the formidable Dowager Duchess of Moreland. The old woman had been a notorious beauty in her youth and a ruthless power broker in her later years. Ilara had met her only once, and the experience had been akin to being examined by a hawk. The Dowager's letter was brief. It simply requested Ilara's presence at Wyvern Hall. "My grandson," the letter stated, in a spidery, imperious hand, "has made a grave error in judgment. I am not in the habit of allowing my family's mistakes to fester. I require a companion for the autumn months. You will come. Your aunt shall accompany you. I expect you within a fortnight." There was no offer, no question. It was a command, and it was the very last thing Ilara wanted to do. To return to the sphere of the man who had so publicly rejected her, to sit at his table, to watch him court Lady Honoria. It was a torture she could not bear. "We will refuse," her aunt declared, her voice firm. Alara stared at the letter, the strong, determined script. A tiny, nascent spark flickered within the ashes of her despair. To go to Wyvern Hall would be an act of profound discomfort, but to refuse would be to admit defeat. It would be to hide. And Vance, her father had always told her, never hid. They stood their ground, even when the field was lost. She thought of the Duke's handsome face, frozen in aristocratic contempt. She thought of the Dowager Marchioness's triumphant smile. She thought of the life she had imagined, the quiet companionship, the shared love of literature, the warm evenings by the fire. It was all gone, destroyed. But she was not yet destroyed. She lifted her chin, a gesture that was becoming a habit. She met her aunt's worried gaze. "We go," Alara said, her voice quiet but resolute. "We go to Wyvern Hall. If the Dowager wants a companion, I will be the most diligent, the most poised, the most untouchable companion she has ever had. I will show them all that their cruelty has not broken me." A new, unfamiliar feeling began to stir within her, a cold, hard ember of defiance. She would go back. She would face the Duke and his new bride-to-be, and she would show him exactly what he had so carelessly thrown away. This time she would be the one behind the wall of ice. The approach to Wyvern Hall was like a descent into another world. The carriage rolled through ancient woodlands where the trees met overhead, their branches gnarled and heavy with moss. The air grew cool, smelling of damp earth and fallen leaves. It was a place of immense, brooding beauty, a fortress of nature that seemed to mirror the character of its master. Alara felt the walls of her carefully constructed composure tremble as the house finally came into view, a sprawling edifice of gray stone, with mullioned windows and soaring towers that had watched over this valley for 400 years. The Dowager Duchess received them in a small, intimate parlor. She was a woman of considerable age, her body frail, but her eyes, sharp and dark, missed nothing. She sat in a high-backed chair by the fire, a silver-topped cane resting against her knee. "So," she said, her gaze sweeping over Alara's simple gray traveling gown, "you came. I was not sure you would have the medal." Alara curtsied with perfect grace. "Your Grace's summons was an honor I could not decline." The old woman gave a short, dry laugh. "Honor, I'm sure. Sit down, girl. You will not melt in the heat of the fire." She dismissed Alara's aunt with a flick of her wrist. "Go and see to your rooms. I wish to speak with Lady Alara alone." When they were alone, the Dowager studied her with an unnerving intensity. "My grandson," she began, her voice low and laced with contempt, "is a fool. A brilliant, capable, deeply wounded fool. He has allowed the poison of that Rothwell harpy and her simpering daughter to cloud his judgment." Alara remained silent, her hands folded in her lap. "He is to announce his engagement to Lady Honoria at the autumn ball," the Dowager continued. "It is a disastrous match. The girl is as shallow as a puddle and twice as grating, but he is stubborn. He believes it is his duty to secure the estate's future with a politically suitable alliance. He has buried his heart so deep he has forgotten it exists." She leaned forward, her eyes boring into Alara's. "I did not bring you here to be his companion. I brought you here to remind him what he is throwing away. I want you to be a silent, constant, radiant presence in this house. I want him to see the steel and grace he rejected. I want him to suffer." The Dowager's plan was as audacious as it was cruel. It was also a lifeline. It gave Alara a purpose beyond mere endurance. It allowed her to stay not as a victim but as a woman with a mission. That night she dined with the family for the first time. The Duke was at the head of the table, his expression as cold and remote as ever. He acknowledged her with a stiff, formal bow, a faint flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, crossing his features before being ruthlessly suppressed. The Dowager Marchioness of Rothwell sat opposite, her smile a mask of triumph. Lady Honoria, a porcelain beauty with honey-colored curls and vacant blue eyes, chattered incessantly about ribbons and the latest gossip from London. She had a brittle, grating laugh, and a way of touching the Duke's arm that made Ilara's skin prickle. The meal was an exercise in exquisite torture. Ilara ate little, her spine rigid, her responses measured. She spoke when spoken to, her voice calm and her expression serene. She was the picture of polite composure, and it infuriated the Duke. He found his gaze drawn to her again and again. She was thinner than he remembered. The dark circles under her eyes told a story of sleepless nights, a story he had authored. And yet she was not diminished. There was a new quality to her, a formidable stillness, a quiet dignity that was far more powerful than Honoria's childish flirtations. It was disturbing. He had expected her to cower, to fade into the woodwork. He had not expected this quiet, watchful strength. As the ladies rose to leave the gentlemen to their port, Ilara found herself alone for a moment in the grand hall. The portraits of his ancestors stared down at her, their painted eyes full of judgment. She was studying a landscape of the estate when she sensed his presence behind her. The air in the vast space shifted, charged with a sudden, unspoken tension. "Lady Ilara," he said, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. "I did not expect to find you here." She turned to face him, her heart slamming against her ribs. The dim light threw the hard planes of his face into sharp relief. He was so beautiful, so forbidding. The memory of his public rejection rushed back, a wave of fresh pain. "The Dowager Duchess was most persuasive," she said, her voice cool. "And she is not a woman one easily refuses, as you of all people should know." The flicker in his eyes was one of pure frustration. "This is not a game, Ilara." "No, Your Grace," she replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It is a lesson." She held his gaze for a long, breathless moment. Then, with a slight inclination of her head, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the shadow of his ancestors. She had won this first, small battle, but the war, she knew, had only just begun. Her heart was a fragile, wounded thing, but for the first time in months, it was beating with something other than despair. The days at Wyvern Hall settled into a strange, tense rhythm. The Duke spent his mornings attending to estate business, his afternoons riding the vast moorlands, and his evenings enduring the increasingly cloying attentions of Lady Honoria. The Dowager Marchioness was ever present, a smug spectator to what she believed was her inevitable victory. The official engagement was to be announced at the forthcoming autumn ball, an event that would gather the most prominent families of the county. Ilara, in her role as the Dowager's companion, existed in a world apart. She read to the old woman in the afternoons, her voice low and soothing, her presence a calm antidote to the frantic energy that Lady Honoria brought to every room. She walked in the walled garden, now bursting with the fiery colors of late autumn. She existed, as the Dowager had instructed, as a silent, radiant reminder of all the Duke was about to lose. The Dowager's plan was working, but with a subtlety that surprised even Ilara. The Duke was no longer able to ignore her. She felt the weight of his gaze during dinner. She felt the heat of it when she passed him in the corridor. It was no longer a look of detached dismissal. It was a look of intense, bewildered scrutiny. He was watching her, studying her, and the effort to maintain his icy composure was beginning to show. One rainy afternoon, Ilara sought refuge in the vast two-story library. It was her favorite room in the house, a sanctuary of leather and paper and the quiet scent of old books. She was perched on a window seat, a volume of Wordsworth open in her lap when the door opened and he walked in. He stopped short, clearly not expecting to find her there. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then continued into the room, his boots making no sound on the thick carpet. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said. His voice formal. "I needed a map from the atlas." He moved to a far table, his back to her. The air in the room grew thick. She could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. He was so close, and yet the distance between them felt like an ocean. "You have been avoiding me," he said abruptly, his back still turned. I have been keeping to my duties, she replied, her eyes on the page, though she could not focus on a single word. I am a companion, Your Grace. I am not here to be a distraction. He turned then, his gray eyes flashing. And yet you have been a constant distraction. You are in my thoughts when I am on horseback. You are in my mind when I am dining. You are a ghost in every corner of my house. The confession, so raw and unguarded, sent a shock through her. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment the mask was gone. She saw a flicker of the man she had once known, a man tormented by something she could not understand. A ghost of my own making, she whispered, the words bitter on her tongue. You made your feelings perfectly clear in London, Your Grace. You taught me my place. I have learned the lesson well. He took a step towards her, his expression a storm of conflicting emotions. I did what I believed was necessary to protect you, he said, his voice raw. The Rothwell woman made threats. She had evidence she claimed would ruin you. I thought if I distanced myself publicly, if I made it seem as if I never cared, she would lose interest. The world tilted on its axis. Elara stared at him, the book sliding from her nerveless fingers to the floor. The silence in the library was absolute, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain against the window panes. The cold, hard knot of resentment that had sustained her for months suddenly threatened to dissolve. You are saying, she breathed, her voice shaking, that you rejected me to save me. He opened his mouth to speak, but at that very moment the library door swung open with a dramatic creak. Lady Honoria stood framed in the doorway, her eyes darting from the Duke to Elara, a flash of pure jealousy igniting in their vacant depths. Her mother stood just behind her, a predator's smile curving on her thin lips. Alexander, darling, Lady Honoria cooed, her voice dripping with false sweetness. We were wondering where you had got to. Mother says the deliveries from the florist have arrived for the ball, and she wishes for your opinion on the arrangements. You wouldn't want to be late for that, would you? The spell was broken. The intimacy of the moment shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The Duke's face instantly shuddered, the icy mask slamming back into place with terrifying speed. He turned away from Elara, his movements stiff and controlled. Of course, he said, his voice cool, I will be along presently. He did not look back at her. He walked from the room, leaving Elara reeling, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The Dowager Marchioness cast her a long, triumphant look before following her daughter. Elara was left alone, the weight of his revelation pressing down on her. He had rejected her to protect her from a blackmail plot. He had sacrificed her feelings, her reputation, their shared future in a misguided act of nobility. It was not a rejection at all. It was a sacrifice. And now he was about to marry the daughter of the woman who had orchestrated their destruction. The revelation in the library had changed everything, and yet it changed nothing. The Duke remained bound by his perceived duty to his name. He had chosen his path, and he was too proud, too wounded to step from it. The evening of the autumn ball arrived, and with it, a feverish energy that seemed to electrify the very stones of Wyvern Hall. The house was transformed. Garlands of ivy and late-blooming roses were woven along the banisters. The ballroom shimmered with the light of hundreds of candles, their flames reflected in the polished oak floors. The orchestra was even now tuning their instruments in the gallery, the discordant notes a jarring counterpoint to the rising tide of anticipation. Tonight, the Duke would announce his engagement to Lady Honoria. The news would be the talk of the county, the final seal on Elara's public humiliation. Elara dressed for the ball with a sense of grim, fatalistic purpose. Her aunt helped her into a gown of deep forest green velvet. The color was rich, elegant, and subtly powerful. It was the color of the ancient woodlands that surrounded Wyvern Hall, the color of the land the Duke so cherished. It was a deliberate choice. She would not fade into the background. She would be a presence, not a victim. As she descended the grand staircase, she felt the familiar weight of stairs upon her. But tonight she did not feel their sting. She felt only a strange, icy calm. She had made a decision. She would not stand by and watch him make this disastrous mistake. She would fight for him, even if it meant laying her own heart bare for a second, final time. If he rejected her again, she would leave Wyvern Hall at dawn and never look back. But she would not go down without a fight. The ballroom was a swirling kaleidoscope of color and sound. The heat was immense, the air thick with the scent of perfume and beeswax. She saw Lady Honoria, a vision in pale pink silk, clinging to the Duke's arm, her laughter a high, grating peal. The Dowager Marchioness was holding court near the fireplace, her eyes sharp and watchful. The Duke's gaze found Alara the moment she entered. He watched her move through the crowd, her green gown a slash of defiant color against the pale silks of the other women. She was magnificent. A wave of despair washed over him. He was about to doom himself to a lifetime of Honoria's vacuous chatter, and the woman who held his soul was standing not 20 feet away, looking like the spirit of the autumn itself. The moment for the announcement drew near. The Dowager Marchioness gave a subtle nod. The Duke stepped forward, his expression a mask of granite. The music died away. A hush fell over the crowd. He turned to face his guests, his hands clasped behind his back. "My friends," he began, his voice resonating through the vast room, "I have asked you here tonight to share in a matter of great importance." Alara felt her heart stop. This was it, the end of everything. "A matter concerning the future of Wyvern Hall," he continued, his gaze sweeping the room. It landed on Alara, and for a heartbeat he faltered. He saw the quiet strength in her face, the unspoken challenge in her eyes. He saw the woman he loved, standing in the lion's den, daring him to be the man she believed he could be. A movement near the back of the room caught his eye. A tall, gray-haired man was pushing his way through the crowd. It was his solicitor, Mr. Finch, his face ashen, his wig askew. He was clutching a bundle of papers, his movements urgent and agitated. The Duke stopped, his announcement forgotten. "Your Grace," Mr. Finch gasped, his voice trembling. "Forgive the intrusion, but this cannot wait." He thrust a letter into the Duke's hand. "It has come to light, a matter of the most serious legal gravity. It concerns the true inheritance of Wyvern Hall." A ripple of shock ran through the assembled guests. Whispers erupted like a swarm of startled birds. The Dowager Marchioness went pale, her triumphant smile crumbling into dust. The Duke tore open the letter, his eyes scanning the dense legal script. His face, already pale, drained of all color. He swayed slightly, his hand reaching out to steady himself on the back of a chair. The cold, unshakable Duke of Moreland looked utterly and completely shattered. He looked up, his gaze darting around the room in confusion before finally settling on Alara. The words he read had just turned his entire world inside out, and he did not know where to turn. The announcement of his engagement would not be made, for he had just learned a secret that threatened to strip him of his title, his estate, and the very legitimacy of his name. The revelation in the library had changed everything, and yet it changed nothing. The Duke remained bound by his perceived duty to his name. He had chosen his path, and he was too proud, too wounded to step from it. The evening of the autumn ball arrived, and with it, a feverish energy that seemed to electrify the very stones of Wyvern Hall. The house was transformed. Garlands of ivy and late-blooming roses were woven along the banisters. The ballroom shimmered with the light of hundreds of candles, their flames reflected in the polished oak floors. The orchestra was even now tuning their instruments in the gallery, the discordant notes a jarring counterpoint to the rising tide of anticipation. Tonight, the Duke would announce his engagement to Lady Honoria. The news would be the talk of the county. The final seal on Alara's public humiliation. Alara dressed for the ball with a sense of grim, fatalistic purpose. Her aunt helped her into a gown of deep forest green velvet. The color was rich, elegant, and subtly powerful. It was the color of the ancient woodlands that surrounded Wyvern Hall, the color of the land the Duke so cherished. It was a deliberate choice. She would not fade into the background. She would be a presence, not a victim. As she descended the grand staircase, she felt the familiar weight of stairs upon her. But tonight she did not feel their sting. She felt only a strange, icy calm. She had made a decision. She would not stand by and watch him make this disastrous mistake. She would fight for him, even if it meant laying her own heart bare for a second, final time. If he rejected her again, she would leave Wyvern Hall at dawn and never look back. But she would not go down without a fight. The ballroom was a swirling kaleidoscope of color and sound. The heat was immense, the air thick with the scent of perfume and beeswax. She saw Lady Honoria, a vision in pale pink silk, clinging to the Duke's arm, her laughter a high, grating peal. The Dowager Marchioness was holding court near the fireplace, her eyes sharp and watchful. The Duke's gaze found Alara the moment she entered. He watched her move through the crowd, her green gown a slash of defiant color against the pale silks of the other women. She was magnificent. A wave of despair washed over him. He was about to doom himself to a lifetime of Honoria's vacuous chatter, and the woman who held his soul was standing not 20 feet away, looking like the spirit of the autumn itself. The moment for the announcement drew near. The Dowager Marchioness gave a subtle nod. The Duke stepped forward, his expression a mask of granite. The music died away. A hush fell over the crowd. He turned to face his guests, his hands clasped behind his back. "My friends," he began, his voice resonating through the vast room, "I have asked you here tonight to share in a matter of great importance." Alara felt her heart stop. This was it, the end of everything. "A matter concerning the future of Wyvern Hall," he continued, his gaze sweeping the room. It landed on Alara, and for a heartbeat he faltered. He saw the quiet strength in her face, the unspoken challenge in her eyes. He saw the woman he loved, standing in the lion's den, daring him to be the man she believed he could be. A movement near the back of the room caught his eye. A tall, gray-haired man was pushing his way through the crowd. It was his solicitor, Mr. Finch, his face ashen, his wig askew. He was clutching a bundle of papers, his movements urgent and agitated. The Duke stopped, his announcement forgotten. "Your Grace," Mr. Finch gasped, his voice trembling, "forgive the intrusion, but this cannot wait." He thrust a letter into the Duke's hand. "It has come to light, a matter of the most serious legal gravity. It concerns the true inheritance of Wyvern Hall." A ripple of shock ran through the assembled guests. Whispers erupted like a swarm of startled birds. The Dowager Marchioness went pale, her triumphant smile crumbling into dust. The Duke tore open the letter, his eyes scanning the dense legal script. His face, already pale, drained of all color. He swayed slightly, his hand reaching out to steady himself on the back of a chair. The cold, unshakable Duke of Moreland looked utterly and completely shattered. He looked up, his gaze darting around the room in confusion before finally settling on Alara. The words he read had just turned his entire world inside out, and he did not know where to turn. The announcement of his engagement would not be made, for he had just learned a secret that threatened to strip him of his title, his estate, and the very legitimacy of his name. The ballroom dissolved into chaos. Guests were hastily ushered from the house by bewildered footmen, their carriages summoned in a frantic scramble. The Duke stood frozen in the center of the grand hall, the crumpled letter still clutched in his hand. The Dowager Duchess, her face a mask of grim fury, ordered everyone out, her voice cutting through the pandemonium. The Rothwells were the last to leave, the Dowager Marchioness's face a portrait of venomous rage, her daughter sobbing in bewildered confusion. Only Alara remained. She stood in the shadow of the grand staircase, unseen, her heart aching for the man who had been her tormentor and her salvation. He looked so alone, so utterly defeated. The icy facade had shattered, revealing a man drowning in a sea of uncertainty. She did not approach him. She knew he needed to face this crucible alone. This was his battle to fight. She could only watch and wait. The days that followed were a maelstrom of hushed conferences and frantic legal consultations. Mr. Finch was a permanent fixture in the Duke's study. The secret, Alara learned, was a devastating one. The previous Duke, Alexander's father, had been married before his marriage to Alexander's mother. A clandestine, youthful union to a woman of low birth, long thought to have been annulled. The annulment papers, it transpired, were forgeries, created by the old duke's ambitious family to pave the way for a more advantageous match. That first marriage had produced a son, a boy who had been cast aside and forgotten. That son was now a man, and he had a son of his own. According to the law of primogeniture, the true claim to the dukedom of Moreland lay not with Alexander, but with this unknown cousin. The entire foundation of Alexander's life, his title, his identity, his very sense of self, had been built upon a lie. He was, in the eyes of the law, a bastard child, a man with nothing. The Dowager Duchess was inconsolable, her formidable strength finally broken by the revelation of her late husband's deceit. The future of Wyvern Hall hung in the balance. The legal battle could drag on for years, but the truth was plain for all to see. Alexander was a duke no more. He did not seek Alara out. He retreated to the high, lonely rooms of the hall, a ghost in his own home. The servants spoke in hushed whispers. The grand estate, once so vibrant, felt like a tomb. Alara's heart ached for him, but she understood. His world had crumbled. He needed time to understand who he was beyond the title he had always borne. Then one evening the quiet was shattered by the arrival of a stranger. A plain, weathered carriage pulled up the long drive. A man stepped out, his clothes simple but well-cut, his bearing quiet and dignified. He was in his early 40s, with the duke's dark hair and the same strong line of jaw. He was accompanied by a young man, barely 20, who looked around at the vast estate with wide, uncertain eyes. It was the true heir. He had come to claim his birthright. He had not come to gloat. He stood in the entrance hall, his hat held respectfully in his hands, and he asked, in a voice that was strangely gentle, to speak with Alexander. Not to humiliate him, but to see the man whose life had been unknowingly built upon a lie. Alexander stood in the doorway of his study, facing the man who represented the end of his world. The silence between them was a living thing, heavy with the weight of 4 decades of secrets and lies. He had expected to feel rage, resentment, a burning sense of injustice. Instead, he felt only a profound, bone-deep weariness. The man, whose name was John Whitfield, was a stonemason from a village in the north. He was a man of quiet dignity, his hands calloused and rough, his face etched with the lines of honest toil. He was not a nobleman. He had no desire for the grandeur of Wyvern Hall. He was, by his own admission, daunted by the very idea of it. "I did not come here to throw you out," John said, his voice low and steady. "I came because I felt I had to see it, to understand. My father, he never spoke of his past. He was a bitter man, but he knew. He knew he should have been a duke. It was the ruin of him." He paused, his gaze traveling over the bookshelves, the portraits, the trappings of centuries of privilege. "This is not my life," he said simply. "My life is my stone, my quiet cottage, my son. I have no wish to uproot my family and pretend to be something I am not. But the law is the law. I cannot ignore what the solicitor has told me." Alexander listened, his face impassive. The man was speaking the truth. He was not a villain. He was a victim, just as much as Alexander was. The true architect of this catastrophe was a man long dead and buried. "What do you want?" Alexander asked, his voice rough. John Whitfield met his gaze. "I want my son to have a chance at a better life. I want him to have an education, a profession. I do not want the title. I do not want this vast, cold house. I want to go home." A fragile, impossible hope began to stir in Alexander's chest. He spent the next hour locked in conversation with the man. It was the strangest negotiation of his life. By the end of it, they had reached an understanding. The legal battle would be costly and ruinous for everyone. An arrangement could be made. John Whitfield would formally renounce his claim to the title and the estate in perpetuity. In exchange, Alexander would settle a substantial, life-changing sum of money upon John and his family, and he would personally guarantee the boy's place at a fine school and later, at Oxford. It was an agreement born of mutual respect, and it came at a heavy price. The Dukedom of Moreland would survive, but the entail was broken. A significant portion of the ancestral lands would have to be sold to fund the settlement. Wyvern Hall would be saved, but it would be diminished. It was a price Alexander was more than willing to pay. For he had learned in the crucible of the past week that a man was more than his title. He was his word, his honor, and his heart. The news of the resolution spread quickly. The Tun, which had been poised to revel in the Duke's downfall, was stunned by the quiet, dignified manner in which he handled the crisis. The scandal had not broken him. It had, in a strange way, set him free. The Rothwells, sensing the shift in the wind, had already retreated to their own estate, their scheming exposed. The engagement was, by silent, mutual consent, at an end. It was a cold, clear morning in late autumn when Alexander finally sought out Alara. He found her in the walled garden, her cloak pulled tight around her shoulders. She was standing by the rose bushes, their branches now bare and dormant, waiting for the long sleep of winter. She heard his footsteps on the gravel path and turned. The look in her eyes was not one of triumph. It was one of quiet, patient understanding. He stopped a few feet away from her. The barriers he had built between them, born of pride and fear and a misguided sense of duty, had finally crumbled to dust. The man who stood before her was not the cold Duke. He was simply Alexander, stripped of his armor, his heart laid bare. "I have been a fool," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have been proud and blind and cruel. I believed that to protect you I had to push you away. I believed that my duty to my name was more important than the truth of my heart. I was wrong. On every count I was wrong." He took a step closer, his gray eyes, once so cold, now full of a desperate, burning intensity. "I rejected you publicly. I humiliated you. I broke your trust and your heart, and in doing so I shattered my own. I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. I have no right to even stand before you now. But I cannot let another moment pass without telling you the truth." He drew a ragged breath. "I love you, Alara. I have loved you from the moment you first argued with me about the poetry of Blake. I love your strength, your grace, your quiet courage. I love the way you stood in this very garden unbroken when the rest of the world would have crumbled. You are the only future I want, a future I know I do not deserve." The words hung in the crisp morning air. Alara felt the tears welling in her eyes, but she did not try to stop them. They were tears not of sorrow, but of release, of a long, painful journey finally reaching its end. She had wanted to hate him. She had tried to build a wall around her heart, but he had just torn that wall down with his honesty. "You are a fool, Alexander Ashworth," she whispered, her voice breaking. "A magnificent, infuriating, misguided fool. I came here with a heart full of ashes, determined to show you what you had thrown away. But I was only fooling myself. My heart was never in my own keeping. It has been yours all along." A sob escaped her lips. "I love you," she breathed. "I have never stopped loving you." He crossed the distance between them in two swift strides and gathered her into his arms. The force of his embrace was both desperate and tender, as if he could not believe she was truly there. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt the tremor that ran through his body. The cold, impenetrable Duke was weeping. The kiss that followed was not a gentle thing. It was a desperate, searing act of reclamation. It was the taste of regret and the promise of redemption. It was the end of a long, bitter winter and the first glorious, undeniable promise of spring. They clung to each other as if they were the only two people in the world. When they finally broke apart, the sun was breaking through the morning mist, painting the garden in shades of pale gold. The future was no longer a frightening unknown. It was a path they would walk together, side by side. The whispers of the Tun, the scandals, the trials, they all faded into insignificance. They had weathered the storm. They had faced the very worst of themselves and each other. And in the ruins of the cold Duke's past, they had built a love that was warm, resilient, and unbreakable. A love that would last for all their days.